Hi everyone. So this is Eric presenting on Objective 4 for seed systems. So this presentation I'm going to cover Activity 4.1, which is on developing the communication products in the project, and Activity 4.3 on the development and evaluation of the rapid multiplication models and strategies. So before starting, I just wanted to say I'm representing a large group. So some of the photos here, starting from the top left, Imran, Tui, Saitong, Lautau, Rit, and of course Roosevelt Escobar, our colleague from Cali. I think most of you know all these people already. They're all the members of our team that are operating in the different countries supporting all the seed systems work. So they're really the ones carrying all this forward. I wanted to start just with a simple overview of a seed value chain. So this is a process-based value chain representation. And what I mean by that is that we're looking at processes. So the exchange and use of genetic resources, breeding and selection to registration of varieties, early generation seed production and decentralized multiplication, use and exchange by farmers, traders, and factories and other stakeholders, and then of course the product processing and sale at the end. And we can think of this value chain as being broken up into two main components, the supply component and the demand component. And in this project, we take a systems approach to seed. And so we really have to look at all these components together. It doesn't make sense just to work on one component and ignore the others. So these bubbles are showing some of the things I'll talk about today. Seed policy and law, which is kind of an overarching theme. Communication and extension, seed multiplication and economics, which is covering the early generation and decentralized multiplication sort of part of the system, impactful dissemination of seed, and finally experimental auctions, which are assessing the demand component. Starting with communication products, we have quite a list of products generated over the last couple of years of this project, but it's a bit tedious to go over them one by one. So rather than going over the whole list, I'll just highlight a couple of points. First on the video. So we've been taking an approach to our extension materials where we really try to work together with local stakeholders and also make sure we're not duplicating efforts by also collaborating with groups like CAVAC that are already engaging and making video extension. So you can see an example here where Rith, our staff, is participating in the CAVAC video and lending his expertise. And we've been doing quite a bit of work with the Lao Upland Rural Advisory Service, or LURAS. LURAS produce a lot of farmer extension materials in Lao, and you can see 3 examples of videos on the left that we've produced with LURAS, which are being released on YouTube in many different languages. Finally, this little picture of materials up here just represents that we have ordered a kit from an award-winning group called Access Agriculture that focus on farmer video extension. So with this kit, we'll be able to have a strong showing for video extension in communities without the need for internet or mains power or any of those issues. On factory and community posters, there's an example on the left of a poster we made together with PPC, and a poster on the right looking at mosaic disease and witch's broom that we worked on together with Winrock and USDA that is being put up on factories where farmers get a lot of exposure during the harvest season. And another example is the tunnel construction manual. So a number of our staff have been working on this output over the last several months. This is a 30-page manual, so it's very detailed. It's technically oriented. It includes lists of materials, a step-by-step photo guide with instructions on assembly and construction, schematic drawings like you can see on the right-hand side, and QR code linking to video that also shows the steps. So it's very comprehensive, and at the moment we have 4 language versions. So that really allows us to engage other stakeholders in the construction and use of tunnels. And we'll be following this up with a tunnel management manual, so on all the operational aspects of tunnel use. Activity 4.3 is assessing scaling up of clean seed delivery, so including the production and dissemination of new varieties, but also just clean seeds in themselves. And we've done some evaluation of existing models from the region, as well as assessing some of the other technologies available, like the tunnels we've mentioned, and semi-autotrophic hydroponics, or SAH, which some of you may also already have been exposed to through our colleagues in IITA. And this is sort of addressing this stage in the seed value chain. So going from early generation seed production into decentralized multiplication and scaling up. This schematic is showing sort of a conventional multiplication pathway in which there's a variety or potentially a new variety in tissue culture that's moved into a greenhouse situation to harden and bulk, and then open field multiplication for several cycles. As many of you know, cassava has a very low multiplication rate. So compared to a grain, in cassava's case, you may only get a multiplication of 1 to 10. So 10 clean, good cuttings from one mother plant. And it takes 9 months to a year for the plant to reach maturity. So this is very slow to bulk up and multiply new material. There's also some serious issue with open field multiplication when there are diseases like CMD or CWBD in circulation that can reinfect things in the open field. So this is really the rationale for why we need to focus on rapid multiplication systems that can also maintain the phytosanitary quality of the seed. A little bit of background. In Southeast Asia, when cassava was introduced, it largely escaped its pathogens and pests. So we had 100 years of multiplication and use of cassava in the region that was really almost free of yield-limiting pathogens. So that's obviously changed quite a bit now. And in the meantime, there's been this development of a regional farmer industry network for stem exchange. And those systems are variable in nature. They have participation of different stakeholders, governments, factories, and so on, but none of them are strictly business models per se. So there are no real formal producers and sellers of seed. Activity 4.3 looks a bit at those economics. So along the seed value chain, one thing that we wanted to focus in on is the use of these rapid multiplication tunnels you've heard so much about, piloted with support from the Cali crew of SIAD, who have spent a lot of time refining the tunnel methods, construction, and also operations. So we have to thank our colleague Roosevelt for all the training that he's put in Southeast Asia over the last 2 years. These rapid multiplication tunnels we're mentioning a lot, so I thought for some people who may not be so familiar, it's a good idea just to quickly go over a little summary. If you look on the right, this is future stems in Vientiane. So we have there 6 multiplication tunnels and 1 screen house. And on the left, you can see inside a tunnel, there's a raised bed in the center, and the cassava is sprouting. So the idea with the beds, it's almost a sort of sandponics system where we use small cuttings of mature stems and we place them horizontally into the sand. And because of the arrangement with temperature control and constant humidity through the misters, all of the buds sprout. So this is in big contrast to when you plant in the field, only a few buds at the top sprout. In this case, we can get almost complete sprouting. And it also gives us the ability to use green stem and even lateral branches for planting. So you can see here the stems with sprouts emerging. And when those become big enough, they will be trimmed and placed in a substrate inside the tunnel or in the screenhouse to harden and continue growing roots. And when the roots are ready, they can be transplanted to the field and grown into mature plants just like a conventional cutting. So this allows us to raise the multiplication rate very significantly. In terms of cost, now that we have quite a few tunnels being built around the region, and I'll show you a recap slide of that in a moment, we are starting to get real costs from Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. So we can understand not only the fixed costs, but starting to get a handle on the operational costs involved with managing the tunnel systems on site in Asia. So we have data from those several countries, but I thought I would just show a quick example from Vietnam, where 4 tunnels were built, and all in all, the price worked out to about 1,500 US dollars per tunnel. In this case, it's important to mention there was no construction fee because it was constructed by the Taining Group themselves. So that would add some additional expense. But it's also important to say that there's a serious economy of scale effect here. So building 1 tunnel is not very cost effective, but if you're building 6 or 10 tunnels, suddenly the cost per unit goes way down. And even for construction, when the assembly crew gets experience building subsequent tunnels is very rapid. And this allows 6 or 10 tunnels in one group to take advantage of the same water pump and storage system, electricity hookup, and so on. So that 4 tunnel system is representative of a plan for a 10-hectare foundation seed multiplication system. So this is a sort of a brief schematic of what that would look like. So starting with in vitro with tested plants, like all clean seed production systems, moving into an isolated field or greenhouse in order to grow out those plants and produce stems. The stems go into the tunnel, and in the tunnel we can do rapid multiplication with cycle time between 3 and 4 months. So instead of waiting 1 year, in 1 year we can get 3, maybe 4 cycles. From there, the material is hardened and goes into an isolated field for multiplication. And in this case, irrigation is required to make sure that those young seedlings all survived. You get a good rate. And then that produces 10 hectares of foundation material, and we can move on to distribution. So this slide shows an overview of the clean stem multiplication facilities and activities that we have built as of February 2022. So on the right-hand side here, we have tunnel construction. So this is the number of tunnels in each location. So in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, in total, we have 43 tunnels that are built or being finished being built. And those, as Jono mentioned in his overview, those represent private sector, universities, government ministries, and also provincial or district governments. So quite a range of actors are interested in engaging in the model, which is really wonderful to see. We also have some other infrastructure. So at Future Stems, we have a screen house. 2 fiber cell machines have been installed, and I'll talk about those more in a moment. 1 in Laos and 1 has just arrived in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And in Cardi's case, there are 2 large screen houses. This is a case where instead of building the tunnel to spec, they've adapted existing infrastructure to take on rapid multiplication. So of course we have some quite detailed analysis of these processes. I don't want to get into those in this presentation, so instead I think it's more useful to just go over sort of these general comparisons. So again, the calendar will vary a little bit depending on the place, the management, the temperature. So as I mentioned, when those sprouts are ready, they're cut and they need to be put into a substrate in order to grow roots. So we've been also checking into some of the different options. In Cali, the original method used these jiffy pots, which are condensed peat, and you add water, they expand, and then you can root your materials in there. Unfortunately, in Southeast Asia, these are not a great option as they're all imported. They arrive by maritime port and then need to go through customs and be shipped, and this just adds an enormous amount of logistic and cost. On the other hand, we have the fiber cell machine. You can see an example here. So the fiber cell machine is adapted from forestry. So it takes a substrate and it wraps and makes almost like its own jiffies with a paper cover. So in that case, the plantlets can be transplanted into there and that can go directly to the field. In the interim, we've also been using these trays, which are again used from the forest in the forestry sector to prepare tree seedlings. So in terms of comparison, there's no question that the fiber cell lowers the cost per unit extensively, but it does mean some level of maintenance needs to take place. It is a machine, it needs to have a place to live, and it needs to be well regulated and run by somebody with technical knowledge to take care of the machine. So looking at those economics along the value chain, one of the activities was, of course, to compare, before jumping right into the tunnels, to compare options. And we used some of the data from our colleagues at IITA in Nigeria to evaluate the cost structure of the semi-autotrophic hydroponic method for rapid bulking. And this is really a very promising method for bulking that's proven to be quite successful in some situations. There are a number of reasons why we've chosen not to go with it in our case. It is a licensed technology, so there is a fee required in order to be able to use the technology, which is not it's not a large barrier for the technology, but it does mean that replication and working with different partners in order to get that licensing is a little extra challenge. The initial seed unit costs are quite high for SAH, especially if there isn't a building infrastructure, because there does need to be a kind of a permanent structure in order to do that very sensitive step with short plantlets. It also still does require a tissue culture lab, nursery, shade house, and that 9-month outgrowing period. So that's not something we escape with SAH or the tunnels. And I think this has worked very well in a context, for example, this processor-led model that's in this business case in an African factory where there's a high degree of control and there are no other providers of stems in the area. And in our case, it's a little bit different context, and decentralization is very important. So just for a quick comparison here, you can see some of the main key differences. Again, we have a higher level of detail, but for the purposes of this presentation, I think this is an informative level. The replicability for the tunnels in particular is especially high. The operating costs are quite low, and it's very easy to integrate them with existing systems. In terms of centralization, it's much easier for the tunnels to be decentralized. However, I do have to add that we're not talking about a farmer doing this on their own. There is a required level of attention, management, investment, water. So we're talking more about farmers groups, a factory, an association, something of that nature. So moving on to experimental seed auctions. Um, this is an activity that we undertook together with Wageningen University and partners at NAFRI and CARDI in Cambodia. And the point of this exercise is to assess farmer demand and willingness to pay for seeds of different qualities. So this is an experimental economic method, and as the name suggests, it makes use of auctions to increase the accuracy of the data that we collect from farmers. And you can see in the top right here, there's a user guide from the Roots, Tubers, and Bananas initiative of CGIAR, one of the large projects that's just wrapped up in the last round. So several of the people on our project were also involved in the drafting of this user guide. So this is sort of a closer look at how auctions work and how they can be conducted in the field. And it goes towards sort of providing a bit more rigor with the method and collaboration in order to refine those methods and make sure they're really working well in developing country contexts. So we're talking about assessing this section of the seed value chain with auctions. So looking at the use by farmers and the demand part of the value chain. So this is silent bidding, meaning that people are not discussing their bids. We work in groups of 20, and the winner plays the second highest price. So why not the first highest price? Well, the short answer is that there's a whole bunch of game theory behind this for why using the second price incentivizes truthful bidding. So if we use a first price auction, sometimes people will bid excessively high because they know that they'll be the winner, so they'll bid for a small amount excessively high. And people will also underbid to try to lower the general score. And second price auctions There are mathematical proofs why it incentivizes as a successful bidding strategy, telling the truth, your real willingness to pay. So the method works like this. We gather 20 people together and we try to have even male and female participation. We discussed doing them in separate groups, but decided that this was a better way to go. We give the farmer a number, 1 to 20, and then we engage in a socioeconomic pre-survey. So this is going to allow us to later correlate bidding behavior with certain social and economic characteristics. Then we move on to a practice round, and we use soap for the practice round. So farmers are bidding on 2 similar soaps. And the reason we do that is so that they can start to understand the mechanism, but without stimulating too much discussion and thought about cassava stems right away. So this is something, again, it's in agreement with the literature on auctions. So we move from there to a stage where we show a poster and discuss the issue of cassava mosaic disease. So just to get everybody on the same page that there is this disease and that more resistant varieties are available. And then we introduce 3 stem types. So in this case, we're talking about 3 products. The first one is farmer seed, so it's the seed you find in your community. The second one is a bundle of KU50, which is a variety that we found in our tests to be much less susceptible to cassava mosaic disease. And the third one is KU50 again, but it's clean seed. So in that case, the farmer is informed that the seed is tested. So we hold our silent auction. One by one, the farmers place their highest bid they would actually pay for each of the 3 products. And we record the bids and then ask the farmers how many bundles of stems would they buy at that price. Then we share the results on a big piece of paper and we have a discussion about it and gather some additional impressions and insights. So in Laos, we did 20 auctions that kind of all over the major production areas of the country. And that represented 391 participants in 20 auctions. We found in general there was a statistically higher willingness to pay for both the elite variety and in succession the clean seed than farmer seed. And that was a very robust difference. Factors that were affecting willingness to pay were linked to the geography, so remoteness, ethnicity, the availability of land, and the availability and expenses on labor in the last year. So these were all factors that were correlated with higher bidding. And we also found evidence for different strategies for volume purchase and price elasticity attached to them. So there were people who were aiming for a small amount of seed and a high price, hoping they could make sure to lock that in, that they would win that bundle and then do testing and multiplication on their own. And there were other people who were much more business oriented who simply said, I have free land, I need seed, I'll pay for good seed. And they gave maybe a lower bid, but for a much higher volume. This graph here is just showing the prices on the x-axis and the province and villages on the y-axis. And you can see that the trends are really grouping by province. So there's a strong geographic province effect there, with the grand mean bid across all bids for clean seed being 13,300 Lao kip. So that's equal to about $1.3 per bundle. I've also constructed a demand curve here where you can see that the top curve is for the elite clean seed, so clean KU50, much higher willingness to pay and proportion of people willing to pay across the board. Following up on that activity, we actually did a sale of planting material in Attapeu province. So in Attapeu, we hired a very large truck, you can see here, and filled it with stems that were provided from Kunsap factory. So we collaborated with private sector to get those stems. And we calibrated the price that we offered according to the bid responses. So bids were taken from farmers at 13,000 Lao kip. So this was arranged ahead of time, which is not necessarily the most ideal for these spot sale experiences, but it really had to be this way in this case because we were targeting specifically farmers that had been affected by cassava mosaic disease in an effort to replace some of that infected area. So we took bids at 13,000 kip, but on the day of sale, we provided them at factory cost. So it was like a nice surprise for farmers to arrive, and we sold them for 10,000, $1 per bundle. And here there's a histogram of the breakdown. We sold 1,541 bundles, so we immediately sold all our material that we had in the truck. And these are the numbers of bundles that people purchased at that price. So they reserved them at that price of 13,000 kip. So again, showing different strategies that some people prefer a low number of bundles and they're going to do their own testing and multiplication. And other people said, I'm all in. I trust that this is good quality and I want to buy a large amount and replant my whole field. We've now completed a round of auctions for Cambodia as well, together with our great colleagues at Cardi. So this broke things into 4 regions in the southeast, east, northwest, and west for a total of 320 participants. And we don't have the data in hand yet. It's currently being processed and entered by Cardi, but we can already see some interesting trends. So higher prices in certain provinces. As we've seen before, definitely a divide with Thailand supplying stems in the west and Vietnam in the east. Farmers were offering quite low prices in Cambodia, despite being interested, stating great interest in clean seed, but they expressed that their willingness to pay fluctuates greatly, and there will be a much higher willingness to pay for a higher price in a year when stem shortages are experienced. So this could be indicative that there are probably enough stems readily available in that area right now compared to Laos, where the area is still expanding, but there are still many events that will happen that will lead to loss of seed, like disease, flooding, drought, and so on. So in that given year, the willingness to pay would suddenly shoot up. And this is also in line with some of the other results from our surveys, which show that in Cambodia, on average, farmers will purchase some seed every 3rd year. And just a few more observations from the Cambodia team, that cassava mosaic disease arrived later in the northwestern provinces, and farmers were also greatly hesitant, as we see elsewhere, to abandon symptomatic stems. So there's already an investment in stem. This represents money, and it's very hard for smallholders to decide that they need to replace. Now I want to move to the modeling impact of stem dissemination. So this is an activity we undertook together with the University of Florida and also a colleague at Kansas who is now at Kansas State. So this is an effort to do what we call impact network analysis, where we construct a network that represents the region based on the data we have, and then we stimulate it in different ways and simulate the results. So we constructed our model using 19 biological and climatic variables. So we have monthly climate layers, land use proportion, an altitude layer, cassava production area according to ministry data at the provincial level, and the presence and absence of cassava mosaic disease using the pest displays database. So we take all this data and pre-process it, and we go through a process of predictor selection, and we use machine learning in order to extract these variables of importance. So we actually used 5 different machine learning approaches. So logistic regression, GAMS, Maxent, some of you may be familiar with. It's a very commonly used model for distributions in biology and ecology. Support vector machines, and random forest. And by comparing through these measures of model performance, we actually ended up identifying random forest as greatly outperforming the other models. So we continued with a random forest approach for the rest of this analysis. So we then project the risk to the remainder of the region, and we create what we call a network meta-population model. So this model combines all these different layers, and it allows us to look at different scenarios. So here is a scenario we ran, simulating many seasons one after the other under 2 scenarios. Scenario 1, spread with no controls, and scenario 2, spread with complete trade restrictions, so no stem movement from one region to another. And what we found is that there was an average reduction in infection of 46%. And that's especially visible up in this northern area, so northern Thailand, central Laos, and Vietnam. Although you can still see a difference, even in these most intensely affected provinces, the severity is lessened. So what does that look like? In summary, it looks a little bit like this. We used our data from Seed Exchange that was gathered in our research program in 2018 that was funded also by ACR. And we used this CMD presence and climate favorability model that we produced using our risk mapping in the machine learning phase. So we then combine these to get this district level model, and we can run all sorts of scenario simulations. So the simulation that I've shown on the previous slide was for the effects of trade restrictions, but we can equally use this model to identify top locations for surveillance. And we do this by running the model many, many times and identifying those districts that consistently come up as positive. So that gives us an idea that if we survey those particular districts in the field, we have a higher chance of catching early infection spread. Another thing we can do is look at different clean seed deployment strategies. So the way we do that is we run the model forward while replacing infected seed with clean seed at each subsequent season. And we can do things, for example, testing which particular places we should distribute seed to have the biggest impact. And we can also compare what happens if you distribute a large volume of seed in one area or small volumes of seed in different areas. So this is what I was mentioning yesterday in terms of a data-driven approach where we can say we used all the available evidence and we produced a data-driven recommendation. So we're not just deciding how we're going to do this surveillance and clean seed deployment based on some political or other decisions. We're using data. And it's important to note that as CMD spreads and we get more data about where the incidences are in the location, this model can be updated. So we can run it again, pulling that data from pest displace, and we can update the model as frequently as we wish. The last thing I want to talk to you about today is a little seed policy exercise that I've been leading. So we've done a systematic search of 4 major legal databases that compile regulations, policies, and laws in Southeast Asia. And we've extracted 136 of those items, as well as membership in key international trade blocs, treaties, and organizations that have impacts on seed regulation and management. So you can see in this graph here, this is a timeline. It's just a bar chart along the years where you can see the number of policies and laws in Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia that have been passed. So this gives us a bit of an idea of in-time trends that are occurring. And that really becomes valuable when we overlay that with some key memberships that were happening in different treaties and different movements that were occurring in these countries at that time. Again, another result from that work, we've got maps of Southeast Asian membership in all these different initiatives that are involved with trade and regional blocs, phytosanitary issues, variety rights and intellectual property, and the Convention on Biodiversity and Nagoya, which of course is very important for seed exchange. So we can start to interrogate this data set with some questions about what was driving policy development and the different trajectories that countries are taking, as well as some of those specific aspects of phytosanitary regulations, restrictions around variety use, and so on. And so very important to have a policy angle on this as well. If we're going to be making recommendations to governments about seed system operationalization, we definitely need to have an understanding of the policy environment. So thank you very much to the partners, and looking forward to a fruitful conversation with you today. Thank you.